Chaney Legacy by Robert Bloch. This story is dedicated, with gratitude, to Harlan Ellison. Nobody thought Dell was crazy until the trouble started. True, he'd been a film buff ever since he was a kid, the way other youngsters sometimes get hung up on baseball, football, or even chess. If they follow their hobby into adult life, such interests can become an obsession. Yet no one thinks it's a sign of insanity. In Dell's case, his studies led him into teaching a course on film history at the university, which seems sensible enough. Certainly he appeared to be normal. He wasn't one of those wimpy professors seen in comedy films aimed at the junk food generation. Actually, Dell was rather attractive. Debbie Curzon thought so. She was a newscaster on local radio where she met and interviewed many of the stud celebrities in sports or films. Dell must have had some charisma for her to choose him as a lover. The two of them might have ended up together on a permanent basis if Dell hadn't leased the Chaney house. That's what the realtor called it, the Chaney house, although Dell couldn't verify the claim and the ancient escrow was clouded. The place was really just a small cottage halfway up Nichols Canyon in the Hollywood Hills, huddled amid a tangle of trees and underbrush on a dirt side road, which turned to quicksand during the rainy season. The weather-beaten frame dwelling offered no exterior charm or interior comfort. Debbie's reluctance to share it was understandable, but once he found it, Dell couldn't wait to move in. "All right, do as you please," Debbie told him. "If that dump is more important to you than sharing a brand new condo with me." "It's not just a dump," Dell protested. "This is the Chaney house. Can't you understand?" "Frankly, no. What makes you want to hole up in a place like this just because some dumb actor may or may not have hung out here 60 years ago?" "Lon Chaney wasn't dumb," Dell said. "He happens to be one of the finest performers in silent films. Perhaps the greatest of them all." "Who cares?" Debbie's voice honed to a cutting edge. "I just hope your wonderful Mr. Chaney knows how to cook and is good in bed, because from now on you'll be living with him, not me." It was open warfare. But Dell found no weapon to pierce the armor of feminine logic. In the end, Debbie told him to bug off, and he had no choice but to obey the entomological injunction. A week later, Dell moved into the Chaney house, and by then everybody thought he'd flipped out. Turning down a renewal of his teaching contract now at the end of the fall semester meant losing his chance at tenure. And that certainly was a crazy decision, because he gave no reason for leaving. But Dell knew exactly what he was going to do. He would vindicate himself in the eyes of Debbie and the academic world by writing a Hollywood history of his own, a definitive work which would answer the questions which lurked behind the legends. Who killed William Desmond Taylor, and why? Did Thomas Ince meet his death because of illness, or was it murder? What really kept Garbo from returning to the screen? Had there been cover-ups in the case of Thelma Todd or Marilyn Monroe? So much had been surmised, so little verified. And for a starter, he meant to solve the Chaney mystery. Of all the stars of silent films, Lon Chaney was by far the most mysterious. There were books on his films, but no full-length biographies except for a Reporters Inaccurate magazine series following Chaney's untimely death from cancer in 1930. Chaney's first wife died without breaking silence, and his second left no memoir. His son Creighton, who later changed his name to Lon Chaney Jr., was estranged from his father for many years and avoided painful memories. To this day, Chaney's private life remains an enigma. Between pictures, he told reporters, there is no Lon Chaney. The coincidence of moving into one of the actor's former residences challenged Dell. Come what may, he meant to learn Lon Chaney's secret. But first, there were more practical questions to deal with. Once furniture arrived and utilities were installed, he had to renovate his surroundings. The cottage had been unoccupied for many years. No wonder the realtor offered him such a bargain rental. and it was time for a thorough house cleaning. So Dale called an agency and secured the services of a Hispanic lady named Juanita. She was short, plump, but surprisingly strong. Perched on a rickety ladder, she scrubbed away at the ceiling and sidewalls, then descended to attack the floors with mop and brush. And on the second day, she made her discovery. Finishing up her work, she cleared out old boxes and empty cartons from the bedroom closet. The last carton, wedged in back under a jumble of debris, was not entirely empty. "Look what I find," Juanita said, holding up her trophy for Dale's inspection. He took the tin box from her, hefting it with both hands. Then he lifted the lid and his eyes widened. "What is it?" Juanita asked. The box was empty, but its interior was divided into a number of small compartments lined with smudged cloth, and the underside of the lid was covered by a mirror. "Some kind of kit," Dale said. It was hard to keep his voice from quavering, hard to conceal rising excitement as he paid and dismissed Juanita. When she left, Dale picked up the box again, and now his hands were trembling. His hands holding Lon Chaney's makeup kit. Dale had seen publicity stills of Chaney displaying a different and much larger kit with side trays, so this obviously wasn't the only one. What made it unique was that this box was here, in Chaney's secret hideaway. Or was it? Dale forced himself to face facts. In spite of the realtor's claim, he couldn't be certain that Lon Chaney ever lived here. For all he knew, the kit might have belonged to any one of 1,000 actors residing in these hills when Hollywood was young. What Dale needed was proof, and staring at the bottom of the box, he found it. Wedged against the base was a coil of paper, a small square scrap which must have peeled off after being pasted below the mirror. Dale picked it up, smoothed it out, then read aloud the lettering typed across its surface. "Property of Leonidas Chaney." Leonidas. This was proof and no mistake. While the general public knew the actor as Lon and most filmographies listed his first name as Alonzo, Dale was one of the few aware that the star's birth certificate identified him as Leonidas. Chaney, born on April Fool's Day, had fooled his public, and, considering his passion for privacy, it seemed odd he'd put his real name here, but perhaps he'd fixed on his deception later in his career. Dale's inspection told him that this battered box was old, perhaps dating back to pre-Hollywood days when Chaney was a struggling actor in traveling shows. Could this actually be his very first makeup kit? One thing seemed certain. Chaney had lived here. But when? Dale pondered the question as he sat in gathering darkness alone, with the makeup kit on the table before him. From what little he knew, Chaney's homes were modest by Hollywood standards, even after he attained stardom, but he would never have settled his family here, which left only one other plausible answer. Suppose this place was really a hideaway, a place his family didn't know about, a place he came to secretly and alone. According to publicity, he did have a cabin up in the mountains where he went fishing between films. Could it be that he actually spent some of that time here, perhaps even without his wife's knowledge? And, if so, why? Dale quickly dismissed the notion of a secret love life. Chaney was never a womanizer, and even had he been, this was hardly the setting for a romantic rendezvous. Nor was he a closet alcoholic or drug addict. In any case, there'd be no reason for him to keep a makeup kit hidden here. Dale leaned forward, peering at the box through the twilight shadows which fell across its murky mirror. But the mirror wasn't murky now. As he stared, something in the mirror stared back. For a moment Dale thought it was his own face, distorted by a flash of fading sunlight amidst the coming of the dark. Even so, he realized that what he saw was not a reflection. There was another face, a face in the mirror, a ghastly white face with painted features that glowed and grinned. With a shock, he realized what it was: the face of a clown. And before Dell's widened eyes, the face was melting, changing, so that now a second clown loomed, leering out at him, cheeks spotted with paint and tufts of hair suddenly sprouting above a bony brow. Dell turned, seeking a glimpse of someone else, some intruder who must have stolen silently into the bedroom to stare over his shoulder. But save for himself, the room was empty, and when his eyes sought the mirror again, the face, or faces, had vanished. All he saw now was his own face reflected in the glass, its features fading in the dark. Dell rose, stumbling across the room to switch on the overhead light. In its welcome glare, he saw the makeup box and the perfectly ordinary mirror mounted within. The clown images were gone. They had existed only in his imagination, or was it his memory? For there had been 2 clowns in Chaney's life. Hastily Dell sought his bookshelves, fumbling and finding the volume containing Lon Chaney's filmography. He riffled through it until a page fell open upon a photograph of the actor in the title role of He Who Gets Slapped. And now it was Dell who felt the slap of recognition. The picture showed the face of the first clown he'd seen in the mirror. Turning pages, he located the still photo of another clown with daubed cheeks and patches of hair clumped on the bone-white skull. Chaney again, and laugh, clown laugh. But there was no mirth in the painted face, and none in Dell's as he banged the book shut and left the room. Left the cottage, left the canyon to drive down to the shelter and sanity of lighted streets below. He parked on Fairfax and entered a restaurant, taking comfort in its crowded quarters and the presence of a friendly waitress who urged him to try tonight's special. But when his order came, he had no appetite for it. Tonight had already been too special for him, and he couldn't forget his confrontation at the cottage. Had he really glimpsed those faces in the mirror, or had the images been evoked from memories of the films seen in retrospective showings long ago? A mirror is just a sheet of silvered glass, and what it reflected must have come from his mind's eye. Dell forced himself to eat, and gradually the tension ebbed. By the time he finished and drove back up the canyon, his composure returned. Inside the cottage, the lights still blazed upon commonplace surroundings, safeguarding against shadows and dispelling doubts. If Chaney had lived here at all, that time was long gone and the actor himself was long dead. There were no ghosts, and the box on the bedroom table was merely an old makeup kit, not a miniature haunted house. For a moment, Dell had an impulse to lift the lid and examine the mirror for added reassurance, then dismissed it. There was no point in dignifying his apprehensions. What he needed was a good night's sleep and a clear head for tomorrow. Truth to tell, he felt drained after the emotional stress of the day, and once he undressed and sought his bed, Dell quickly fell into dreamless slumber. Just when the change occurred, he did not know, but there was a change, and the dream came. In the dream, he found himself awakened, sitting up in bed and staring through darkness at the black blur of the box on the table. And now the impulse he'd rejected upon entering the bedroom returned with an urgency he could not deny. Sometimes dreams seem oddly like films, movies of the mind in which one's own movements are silently commanded by an unseen director, a series of jump cuts and sudden shifts in which one is both actor and audience. Thus it was that Dell both felt and saw himself rise from the bed, captured in a full shot as he moved across the room. Now a cut to another angle, showing him poised above the makeup kit. Then came a close shot of his hand moving down to raise the lid. Moonlight from the window sent a silvery shaft to strike the surface of the makeup mirror, flooding it with a blinding brightness that seethed and stirred. Faces formed in the glass, contoured countenances which seemed frighteningly familiar, even in the depths of dream. Faces changed, and yet there was a lurking linkage between them, for all were Oriental. Some Dell had seen before only in photographs. The evil Chinaman from the lost film Bits of Life, the benevolent laundryman in Shadows, then, in rapid shifts, the vengeful Mandarin of Mr. Wu, the bespectacled elderly image of Wu's father, and a final, frightening glimpse of the chinless, sunken-cheeked, shriveled face of the aged grandfather. They formed and faded, smiling their secret smiles. Now others appeared. The two pirates, Pew and Mary, from Treasure Island, a bearded Fagin out of Oliver Twist, followed by figures looming full length in the mirror's depths. Here were the fake cripples of the Miracle Man, the Blackbird, Flesh and Blood, then the real cripple of the Shock, and the legless Blizzard in the Penalty. Now came a derby-hatted gangster, a French-Canadian trapper, a tough sergeant of Marines, a scarred animal trapper, an elderly railroad engineer, and Echo, the ventriloquist of the Unholy Three. In his dream, Dell stood frozen before the glass as faces flashed forth in faster flickerings, the faces of madmen. Here was a crazed wax museum attendant, a bearded victim of senile delusions, a deranged Russian peasant, the insane scientists of a blind bargain, and the monster. They were laughing at him, grinning in glee as Dell closed his eyes, hands clawing out to close the lid of the makeup kit. Then he staggered back to the bed. There were no images here, only the darkness, and Dell fell into it, fleeing the faces and seeking surcease in sleep. It was morning when Dell's eyes blinked open, welcoming the sanity of sunlight. He stirred, conscious now that last night had been a dream, knowing he'd seen nothing in the mirror. Indeed, he had never even left his bed. As he rose, he glanced over at the box resting on the table, remembering how he'd closed it in reality before retiring, then closed it again in his nightmare. But now the lid was up. For a moment, Dell recoiled, fighting the irrational explanation until sunlight and common sense prevailed. The makeup kit was old, its hinges worn or even sprung. Sometime during the night, the catch must have loosened, and the lid popped up. It was a logical answer, but even so, he had to force himself toward the table, steel himself to gaze down into the mirror set inside the lid and gaze on what was reflected there. Sunshine formed a halo around the image in its glassy surface, the image of his own face. And as his features formed a smile of rueful relief, Dell turned away. The mirror and the makeup kit held no terrors for him now, any more than the one he faced as he shaved. He dressed and sought the makeshift kitchen, taking comfort in the familiar ritual of preparing his breakfast, then eating eggs and toast with a copy of the Morning Times propped up before his coffee cup. Even the news offered an odd comfort of its own, the familiar headlines and stories of wars, terrorist bombings, political corruption, street crime, drug busts, accidents, epidemics, natural and unnatural disasters that filled the newspaper pages. However grim, these were realities. Realities which he and everyone else in the world faced with fortitude born of long familiarity. They had nothing to do with the unhealthy fantasies which took form when Lon Chaney stalked the screen. Fantasies which existed now only in Dell's imagination. Glancing at his watch, he folded the paper and rose quickly. There was a busy day ahead, and time was already running short. Leaving the cottage, he drove down to Hollywood Boulevard, turned right, then made a left on Fairfax. He reached Wilshire and headed west, weaving through noonday traffic until he found a parking space before the imposing structure of the Motion Picture Academy of Arts and Sciences. Here, upstairs in the Margaret Herrick Library, he turned his attention to the files he requested. Lon Chaney wasn't the only movie monster he meant to deal with in his projected history. There was research to be done on other stars of the horror film. And unlike the case with Chaney, there was ample material on men like Karloff, Laurie, and Lugosi. But even as he scribbled notes, Dell found something lacking in the interviews and biographical data of these celebrated actors who seemingly made no mystery of their careers. The one missing element common to all was that of explanation. Why had a gentle gentleman like Boris ended up playing monsters? What had led Peter Lorre, the rabbi's grandson, to the portrayal of psychopaths? How did Bela Lugosi, who played parts ranging from Romeo to Jesus Christ in early European appearances, transform himself into the dreaded Count Dracula? William Henry Pratt, Laszlo Lowenstein, Bela Blasco, all three men had changed their names. But what had changed their natures? Dell found no answer in the files, but the last item he read before leaving the academy offered a hint. It was an interview with an actress who toured with Lugosi in Dracula. She told of how the genial cigar-smoking Hungarian prepared for his famous role, sitting before his dressing room mirror and donning the costume and makeup of the vampire. But that was only a preliminary to performing. The next and most crucial step came as he rose, wrapped in the black cape, face contorted and eyes blazing. As he confronted himself in the mirror, his deep voice invoked an incantation. "I am Dracula," he intoned. "I am Dracula. I am Dracula." Over and over again he repeated the words, and by the time he strode out upon the stage, the words became reality. Lugosi was Dracula. "He psyched himself up," the actress explained. And as the years passed, a part of him became the part he played. When he died, he was buried in Dracula's cape, with Dracula's ring on his finger. Dell jotted down his notes, then hurried out into the afternoon sunshine. Now it was time to drive into Beverly Hills for a medical appointment. It had been made a month ago, just an annual checkup, as a matter of routine. But now, as he arrived and took a seat in the crowded waiting room, Dell felt uptight. He felt no worry about possible physical illness, but what about psychological stress? Last night's dreams might be a symptom of mental disturbance. What if Dr. Pendleton told him he was cracking up? By the time the receptionist called his name and a nurse led him to the examining room, he knew his pulse was pounding and his blood pressure had risen. So it came as a pleasant surprise when the doctor made no comment on his readings, other than remarking he thought Dell was underweight and seemed overtired. Reports on blood tests and urine specimen would be available in a few days, but nothing indicated cause for concern. "Slow down a little," Dr. Pendleton said. "Pace yourself, and it won't hurt if you put on a few pounds." Armed with that advice, Dell left. Relieved, he headed for a seafood restaurant on Brighton Way, and there he ordered and actually enjoyed his meal. The doctor was probably right, Dell decided. He had been working too hard, and the tension flaring up after his break with Debbie took an added toll. He resolved to follow orders, rest and relax. Then, perhaps, it might be possible to come to terms with himself, and with Debbie too. He really missed her, missed the hours they spent together, and the breach must be mended, all in good time. As Dell left the restaurant, he sensed a change in the air. The chill breeze hinted at rain, and a muted murmur of distant thunder confirmed its coming. The first drops spattered the windshield as he turned onto the canyon-side road, and by the time he parked in the driveway, a flicker of lightning heralded the downpour that followed. Dale hurried into the cottage beneath the wind-tossed trees. Once inside, he flipped the light switches as he moved from room to room. It was only upon reaching the bedroom that he halted when its overhead light came on. Standing in the doorway, he stared at the open makeup box on the table, forehead furrowed in doubt. Hadn't he closed the lid before he left? Dale shrugged in uncertainty. Perhaps the loose catch was the culprit once again. He'd better examine it and put his mind to rest. Rain drummed the rooftop in a faster tempo and lightning flashed outside the window as he crossed to the table. Then, as he reached it, a clap of thunder shook the walls and the lights went off, overhead and throughout the cottage. Power outages were not uncommon hereabouts during a storm, and Dale wasn't alarmed. Perhaps the lights would come back on in a moment. He waited, but the darkness persisted and prevailed. Maybe he'd better look for his flashlight. Then its illumination was unnecessary, as the lightning bolt struck somewhere close outside the window, filling the bedroom with a greenish glare. As it did so, Dale peered down at the mirror inside the lid of the makeup kit and froze. The reflection peering up at him was not his own. It was the face of Singapore Joe, the role Chaney played in The Road to Mandalay, the half-blind man whose left eye was covered with a ghastly white cast. But the image seemed strangely blurred. Dale blinked to clear his vision as the lightning faded and the room plunged into darkness again. Dale's shudder wasn't prompted by the roar of thunder. It was what he'd seen that traumatized him. The Road to Mandalay was one of the lost films. He knew of no print in existence. But Singapore Joe existed, in the mirror, existed in an indelible image leering up at him through the dark. And the dark must be dispelled. Dale turned and blundered his way into the hall. Reaching the kitchen, he stooped and opened the cabinet beneath the sink. Lightning outside the kitchen window came to his aid, and in its moment of livid life he found and grasped the flashlight. It was not just an ordinary cylinder type, but one which terminated in a square base, projecting a strong beam of almost lantern-like intensity. Dell switched it on, and the ray guided him back to the bedroom. As he walked, his relief faded with the realization that his vision had faded too. He was seeing only with his right eye now. The left was blind. Blind like the eye of Singapore Joe. "You're having a nightmare," he told himself. But he wasn't asleep, and if there was a nightmare, it had to be in the mirror of the makeup kit. Unless, of course, he was hallucinating. There was only one way to find out, and Dale knew what he must do. Rain swept across the rooftop above. Doors creaked and groaned against the onslaught of the wind. Lightning glimmered. Thunder growled. Only the light he gripped in his hand was reassurance. A magic lantern to protect him on his way. Magic lantern. That's what they called the movies in the old days. Was there such a thing as magic? Forcing himself toward the bedroom table, he gazed down at the glass reflected in the lantern light. Half blind, he stared, but what he saw with his right eye was just a mirror after all. A shining surface reflected his own familiar face. And now his left eye cleared and he could see again. Dale took a deep breath, then expelled it hastily. For now the mirror blurred and a piercing pain shot through his lower limbs, causing him to crouch. Something pressed heavily against his spine, bowing his back. He was changing, and the image in the mirror was changing too. He saw the tousled hair, the gargoyle grimace, the twisted limbs, the body bent beneath the hideous hump. No need to ask the identity of this image. He was gazing at Quasimodo, the hunchback of Notre Dame. It was Chaney he saw in the glass, but he himself felt the weight of the hump, the constriction of the harness binding it to his body, the pain inflicted by the mass of makeup covering his face, the jagged teeth wired into his mouth, the mortician's wax masking his right eye. Realization brought relief. It was makeup, and only makeup after all. Gradually the image diffused, and Dale's feeling of physical restraint faded until once again he stood erect. Thunder rolled as the image was dispelled. Dale sighed with relief. Now was the time to slam down the lid of the kit once and for all. He started to reach for it, but his hands were gone. His hands and his arms. Illusion, of course, like the illusion of Chaney's face and form coming into focus beneath the mirror's shiny surface. Dale's eyes met those of the visage peering out at him from under the broad brim of a Spanish sombrero. Chaney was armless, and now Dale felt the agony of numbed circulation, the constriction of his own arms bound against his body by a tight, concealing corset. That, he remembered, had been Chaney's device when portraying the armless knife-thrower in The Unknown. With the recollection, his panic ebbed, and once more features and form receded into the mirror's depths. The numbness was gone from his arms now. He could lift his hands and close the lid. Then he fell. His legs gave way and he slumped to the floor, sprawling helplessly, the box on the table beyond his reach. All he could do was elevate his gaze, see the shaven-headed creature crawling across the glass, dead legs dragging behind him. It was Froso, the paralyzed cripple in west of Zanzibar. No makeup had been involved in the simulation of the man who had lost the use of his lower limbs. It had been Chaney's artistry which made the role seem reality. Knowing that, Dale strove to rise, but there was no feeling in his legs. He couldn't command them. The face in the mirror glowered at him in the lamplight, bursting into brightness as lightning flashed outside the window. The eyes were mocking him, mocking his plight, and now Dale realized that the mirror's monsters sensed his purpose and were summoned to prevent it. Their appearance in the mirror gave them life. His awareness gave them strength to survive, and that strength was growing. Closing the kit would condemn them to darkness, and it was this they fought against. They knew he couldn't close the lid, not if he were blind, armless, or paralyzed. Frantically, Dale balanced himself on the palm of his left hand, extending his right arm upward, inching to the tabletop. Then his fingers gripped the lid of the makeup kit, wrenching it down. With a rasp of rusty hinges, the box slammed shut. The mirror disappeared from view, but Dale's paralysis persisted. Try as he would, he couldn't raise himself. All he could do was wriggle across the floor like a snake with a broken back, and lever his arms against the side of the bed. Pulling his body upward, he lifted himself, gasping with effort, then collapsed upon the cool sheets, which dampened with the sweat of fear pouring from his fevered forehead. Fever. That was the answer. It had to be. The doctor was wrong in his diagnosis. Dale was coming down with something that twisted mind and body. Labeling it psychosomatic brought no relief. Dale rolled over to face the telephone resting on the nightstand beside the bed. If he could reach it, he could call the paramedics. But as his hand moved forward, he felt a sudden tingling in his legs, then kicked out with both feet. The paralysis, real or imaginary, was gone. No reason to summon paramedics now, but he still needed help. In the dim light cast by the flash lantern standing on the table across the room, he dialed Dr. Pendleton's number. The ringing on the line gave way to the mechanical message of an answering service. Dr. Pendleton is not in. Please leave your name and number and he will get back to you. Dale cradled the receiver, frowning in frustration. Sure, the doctor would get back to him, perhaps in an hour, maybe 2 or 3. And then what? How could he explain all this? If he minimized his condition, he'd get that take 2 aspirins and call me in the morning routine. And if he came on too strong, the doctor would probably order up an ambulance on his own. Pendleton was a practitioner of modern medicine. He wouldn't come out in the storm to make a house call merely to humor a hysterical patient with his presence. But Dale had to have someone's presence here, someone to talk to, Someone like Debbie? He dialed her number automatically, and now the very sound of her voice brought relief. Dell, I was hoping you'd call. Then she did care. Thank God for that. He listened intently as the warmth of her response gave way to concern. What's wrong? Are you sick or something? Something, Dale said. That is, I'm not sure. No, I can't explain it on the phone. If you could just come over. Tonight? In all this rain? Debbie, please. I know it's asking a lot, but I need you. I need you now. And I need you, Debbie sighed. All right, give me a half an hour. The phone went dead. But as he replaced the receiver, Dale came alive again. She was coming and he'd told the truth. He did need her. Needed her desperately. Listening, he realized the rain was slowing. It was a good sign. Perhaps by the time she arrived, the storm would be over, and they could talk without the punctuation of thunder. He'd tell her what had happened, make her understand. But just what had happened, and why? Dale rolled over on his back, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, facing up to the shadows surrounding the question in his own mind. And the answer came. He'd found it today at the academy. Found it when he read the actress's description of Bela Lugosi preparing for his portrayal. He psyched himself up. That was her explanation of how Lugosi became Dracula. And that was what Lon Chaney must have done. No wonder he'd established a secret hideaway. Here, in this very room, he did more than experiment with physical disguise. Dale pictured him sitting alone on a night like this, creating contrivances to deform his body, refashioning his face, staring into the mirror at the creature reflected there, and then the final transformation. Make up your mind. A figure of speech, but Chaney had given it a literal application, one beyond the mere application of makeup from his kit. Seated here in the shadowed silence, this man of mystery, this son of deaf-mute parents whom he communicated with through the power of pantomime, confronted the reflections of monsters in the mirror and whispered the words, I am the frog. I am Blizzard. I am Dr. Ziska, Sergei, Alonzo the Armless, the Blackbird, Mr. Wu. Each time a different incarnation, each time a new persona, each time a litany repeated hour after hour, from midnight to dawn, willing himself into the role until the role became reality. And psyching himself up. He'd psyched up the mirror, too. The intensity of total concentration had been captured in the glass forever, just as it was later captured on the blank surface of nitrate film used for silent pictures. The filmed images decayed in time, but the makeup kit mirror preserved Chaney's psychic power forever, a long, latent power revived by Dale's own glimpses into the glass, a power that grew greater with each succeeding gaze. Dale remembered the first apparitions, how fleetingly they appeared, and how little effect they had beyond the initial shock of recognition. It was his repeated viewing which gave strength to the shifting shapes until they transformed his body into a semblance of what he saw. But he wouldn't repeat the mistake. From now on, the makeup kit would remain closed and he'd never look into that mirror again. The rain had ended now, and so had his fear. Thunder and lightning gave way to a calm matching his own. Knowing the truth was enough. He wouldn't repeat all this to Debbie or try to convince her. Instead, he'd just tell her how much he needed her. And that was true, too. But first, he must dispose of the kit. Dale shifted himself over to the side of the bed, sitting up and swinging his feet to the floor. The power outage hadn't ended. He'd shut the kit away in the closet. and take the flash lantern with him and guide Debbie up the path when she arrived. All was quiet as he crossed the room to the table where the lantern light shone on the closed box beside it. That's what the kit was, really. Just a battered old box. Lon Chaney's box, Pandora's box, which opened for evils to emerge. But not to worry. The lid was down and it would stay down forever. His hand went to the flash lantern. At least, that was his intention, until he felt the chill of cold metal at his fingertips and found them fixed upon the lid of the makeup kit. He tried to pull away, but his hand remained fixed by a force commanding his movement and his mind, a power he could not control. It was the power that raised the lid of the box, a power that seethed and surged, and in the up-tilted mirror he saw its source. Two eyes blazed from a face surmounted by a beaver hat and framed by matted hair, a face that grinned to display the cruel, serrated teeth. But it was from the cruel eyes that the power poured, the burning eyes of the vampire in London After Midnight. Dale knew the film, though he'd never seen a print. Knew its original title was The Hypnotist, and it was a hypnotist who glared up at him, a hypnotist's power which had compelled him to open the box and stand transfixed now by the vision in the glass. Then suddenly the face was fading, and for a moment Dell felt a glimmer of hope. But as the face disappeared into the mirror's distorted depths, another face took form. It was a face Dale knew only too well, one which had lain buried in his brain since childhood, when he'd first seen it fill the screen from behind a ripped-away mask. The face of madness, the face of death incarnate, the face of Chaney's supreme horror, the face of Eric in The Phantom of the Opera. No wonder he'd blotted out all memory of the terror which tormented his nightmares as a child, the terror he'd hidden away in adulthood, but which still survived in his unconscious. It was suppressed fear that lay behind his inexplicable interest in Lon Chaney, a fright disguised as fascination which guided him to this ultimate, inevitable confrontation with the gaping fangs, the flaring nostrils, the bulging eyes of a living skull. The phantom stared, and Dell felt the flooding force of the Death's Head's overwhelming power, to which he responded with a power of his own, born of utter dread. For an instant, for an eternity, his gaze locked with that of the monster, and he realized a final fear. The face was looming larger, moving forward, attempting to emerge from the mirror. And then, with savage strength, Dale gripped the box in both hands, raising it high. Panting, he dashed it down upon the floor. The makeup kit landed with a crash as the phantom's image shattered into shards of splintered glass, glinting up in the lantern light. Chaney's power was broken at last, and with it the power of the phantom. Dale gasped, shuddering in relief as he felt full control return. As the knocking sounded its summons, he picked up the flash lantern and carried it with him down the hall to the front door. Debbie was here now, his hope, his angel of salvation, and he went to her proudly and unafraid because he was free of Chaney, free of the mirror's magic, free of the phantom forever. This was the beginning of a new life, a life of love and beauty. Dale opened the door and saw her standing there, smiling up at him. It was only when he lifted the lantern and Debbie saw his face that she began to scream.